Is traditional mainstream media dead? In my city where I live, one of the oldest running news stations, News 1130 in Vancouver, Canada, it closed down permanently after they had been running for about 30 years. And I think that people that have been working in traditional media, they kind of see YouTube. They see YouTube and TikTok and these other platforms as the enemy, and it's not true or real journalism. And I have to disagree. I don't think journalism is dying. I think journalism is changing. I am a television professional with 15 years of experience. I graduated from journalism school, and I've worked in various areas of post-production. I remember sometime before the pandemic, maybe it was around 2018, when I was getting on the SkyTrain, and there was people still handing out newspapers, and I would read newspapers in the morning. So then when the newspaper ceased to exist, does that mean that media in itself partially died? No, I don't think that's the case. And there was a period of time where we believed that radio had died, but if anything, it made a comeback in the form of podcasts, YouTube podcasts. So things evolve. And I know that in the traditional media space, there's a lot of journalists that have been raising the alarm that media is dying. In Canada alone, it is estimated that about between 30 and 40 journalism schools have already permanently closed. I think these journalism programs just decided not to adapt. And I think a lot of the journalism programs that stick to traditional news, that stick to teaching you how to build a 3-minute story, how to write a story for the radio, and they stick to these very old school formats, those schools are the one that cease to exist. But the schools that change part of their program to teach students about social media, about digital media, about telling stories on YouTube, about telling stories through different mediums, those schools will survive. So I don't think that journalism is dying. The amount of wonderful and amazing research and storytelling that I see from people who didn't go to traditional journalism school and who have YouTube channels, I see amazing storytellers. I see amazing researchers. I see amazing investigative journalists that just because they happen to put their work on YouTube, it doesn't mean that they're not doing journalism. Absolutely they are. They're just doing it through a more modern medium. We can think of science journalists such as Veritasium or Mark Rover, or other people such as Cold Fusion, who do amazing work. Great journalism, great researching, great story arcs, and millions of people watch that content. That in itself is journalism. And I think that people in the mainstream media, they have to step away from seeing them as lesser than, and seeing them as that's not real journalism, or seeing them as they're taking away our audiences, they're taking away the work from real journalists. I think that in itself is a little bit toxic. So the way that I would reframe it is mainstream media is changing. What was mainstream 10 years ago is not what is mainstream today. Now, the new mainstream is something like YouTube. If anything, we are living in a world today that we have the most access to information and to research and to journalism that there has ever been. That is a good thing. But of course, there's also the paradox of choices. The more choices that we have, the more we get drowned in information. And sometimes that can be overwhelming to the viewer or to the reader. If I want to learn about a particular topic, I can look for people who are talking about it on Facebook, on Instagram, on TikTok, on YouTube. And there's probably going to be dozens and dozens of people creating content about that topic that I want to learn about. Of course, it also means that people who are untrained can say things that are completely wrong, but also you could argue that depending on the traditional medium, you are also going to find misinformation depending on the interest of the advertisers. And that's something that has always been a thing in traditional media. And that's not to say that the conspiracy theories are correct, but that is to say that it's kind of common sense. If there's a big conflict of interest that affects a particular advertiser and they're giving millions or tens of millions of dollars, of course that is going to affect the way that storytelling is told. But that also happens in places like YouTube. If you have a big sponsor that is giving you a lot of revenue, do you want to make an investigative piece that affects that sponsor? Probably not. So that is something that is going to bleed into any medium, whether it's traditional media, YouTube, TikTok, etc. When sponsors start to get involved, that is going to happen across the board, unfortunately. And what I think as well is I think people in traditional media need to not only learn to adapt, but they just need to accept that things are changing. And YouTube has become the new living room content. So if you look at the numbers, what are people actually watching in the living room? What are families watching during dinner time? What is on the big screen TV? Increasingly now is content that is being posted on YouTube. So no, it doesn't mean that journalism is dead. It's just a lot of journalism is happening on different platforms that we're not used to. People in traditional media who are worried about their work or who are worried about the layoffs or that journalism is dying, they need to stop viewing other platforms as the enemy, because that's not going to fix anything. So I think there's also needs to be a certain level of learning to adapt. How do you take advantage of the new medium that is social media, the new medium that is YouTube? And you can do journalism, but if you see those platforms as the enemy and you see those people as not real journalists, then you're kind of just going to drown yourself slowly out of existence. So people that worked at a radio station for decades, for example, and their radio station gets closed, you can't just say, oh, like, news is dying. No, if anything, the rise of podcasts has been one of the biggest booms that there's ever been. A lot of it just happens to be on YouTube, Spotify, these other different places. And if you learn to adapt, then you can still do radio. It's just going to be in a different place. And of course, that makes things difficult, of course. Or if people aren't funding your documentaries, something that is difficult about journalism is, I think this is true whether it's on YouTube or in traditional media, is that really important journalism doesn't give a lot of revenue, and journalism that is not that important can give a lot of revenue. And a lot of this has to do with advertisers just don't like to get involved with topics that are controversial. They don't want their image to be linked to something that is going to cause outrage with a large part of the population. And especially during the pandemic, like, we remember a lot of YouTubers saying that they got demonetized. But even in traditional media, even if we go way before YouTube, that already was kind of a thing in traditional media. So as a television professional, I'm here to say that real, true, gritty, investigative journalism doesn't generate a lot of revenue, and that's why there's a lot of people that don't do it. There's very few people that I can think of, at least in my region, that do those types of documentaries because they're difficult, because they're hard. It's hard to get funding. And I'm here to tell you as a television professional that that is true. And real journalism, it's difficult, it's gritty. And if you think about like war reporting, like the amount of money that goes into sending somebody overseas, like planning the logistics of all those things. And if you think about war reporting, there's not a lot of money that is generated off of that. If you think about controversial topics, let's just say somebody in Canada wants to do a documentary series about MAID, that is medical assisted dying, and how maybe not everybody who chooses to have MAID should be on it, because maybe they're dealing with things such as homelessness, lack of resources. It takes longer to see a mental health professional than it is to receive MAID. Those sorts of things. And I realize what I just said in itself is very controversial. But let's say that I wanted to make a documentary series about that. It might just have to be a passion project that I'll just have to spend the resources or find an investor, somebody with a lot of money that is passionate about the project, that they don't really necessarily expect a return in their investment, or maybe they just break even and that's it. So what I am getting to here is that when you start to see the big picture, journalism is really similar, whether it's on YouTube, whether it's at a radio station, whether it's on a social media podcast, whether it's in traditional television. There's a lot of these things that are parallel. And I'm here to say, as somebody who went to journalism school and who works in mainstream traditional media, in fact, there's more journalism than there's ever been. It is more accessible than it's ever been. And yes, there's been a lot of journalism school programs that have closed, but the ones that have learned to adapt, that are teaching about digital media, that are teaching about YouTube strategy, those programs are surviving. So it's a matter about adapting, because things always change. There will always be research. There will always be stories. There will always be amazing storytellers. So no, journalism isn't dying. It's changing, and we just need to learn to adapt.